Okay. Okay. So, hi everybody. Welcome to our Bible study for this evening. I expect it to be quite short, I think, because just hold on. I expect it to be quite short because the chapters, section 6 and section 7, aren't too extensive. And these are just basically a retelling of how the church developed after the initial efforts of the pioneers that we've studied about in the past couple of weeks. So it's basically continuing from what Elder Shadrach Nukuvi has been basically teaching us over the past 2 weeks to basically say, okay, cool, that the church developed. These are the structures that they put in place. And these are also some of the significant achievements and the losses that they also faced as the church was growing and developing. So that's basically what we'll be studying for today. So we'll start off with section 6, which is very short. Basically, it speaks to the fact that as the church was developing, there was this overseas missionary that was now gaining momentum. So we read here that MP Tchaikovsky, he was a Catholic. Well, yeah, he was essentially Catholic first, then he converted, and he was one of the people that traveled out to spread the message of the second coming of Christ, as well as other beliefs that are held by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. After his mission, basically the GC session in 1874, there was basically this forward action that was taken in line to basically say missionary work and actively spreading this gospel to other nations is becoming sort of like an effort that is now gaining sort of traction and should be supported officially by the church. So we read here that John Nevins Andrews was appointed the first official overseas missionary, and he was sent out to Switzerland. And soon after his arrival, the European mission was organized, right? So that's essentially what all these pioneers of this time were doing. They were going across the world to organize and set up official missions for the Adventist Church. Andrews also preached in Prussia in 1875 and reported having found that when he already got there was actually a group of about 46 Sabbath keepers, so people who were already keeping the Sabbath. Now, moving on to publishing work in Switzerland, in 1876, basically there was a move or the beginning of publishing that happened in Basel. And yeah, the first SDA periodical, which is the French language Signs of the Times, that's where it came about. After that, the work continued to then spread across Europe. Scandinavia was then entered in 1877 by John Matson, and a publishing house was also established 2 years later. So D.T. Bordeaux was assigned to consolidate the work in France, so basically to bring it together, to establish it properly. And his brother Bordeaux actually worked in Europe as well, in Italy, Germany, France, Switzerland, and Romania. And then we read here that Philip Ryswick, a man who was uneducated and who actually had a speech impediment, was also used in a special way by God to carry the message into Russia. So we see the same themes of God using the unqualified or people who we would characteristically think do not have the skill. Basically, God saying that I will equip you to go forth in my name to basically spread the gospel. So not only that, we see that the work was also established in Great Britain. We have William Ings, who was sent into England in 1878. And in a period of 16 weeks, he had basically gotten 10 people to be Sabbath keepers. Later in the same year, Elder Loughborough arrived to lead out, and in time, the Stan Barrow Press and Newport College were also established. So basically, we see that the Adventist Church was now gaining momentum, and much of that momentum was, how can I say it? It was pushed by the fact that the church was now being active in spreading the gospel, or more specifically, the second coming of Christ to other parts of the world. And later on, we'll also learn about the dangers of not heeding to this call of spreading God's word to other nations and basically concentrating or being concentrated in one region. Yeah, so we'll read more about that and see and learn rather if that is God's will for his church. So these countries that I've already mentioned, those in Europe and even specifically in the UK, they became basically a home base for now saying that, okay, we now have our own missionaries and we're going to send them out to other lands. So that was section 6, basically speaking about the church's efforts in establishing official mission bases across various parts of the world, but mostly specifically concentrated in Europe, your UK, your Switzerland, your France, your Italy's. And yeah, in section 7, we're also now going to learn how from those missionary bases that were established in Europe, how that led to the spreading of the gospel to other parts of the world. And most of like significant or most interestingly, we'll also learn about the significant advances that the church achieved and also the significant losses that it experienced. And this was specifically in the period 1879 up until the early years of the 1900s. So, starting off with significant advances, the church established a youth ministry. So, the first Young People Society was organized in Michigan by two young people, a 17-year-old and a 14-year-old, Harry and Luther, respectively. 20 years later, the Ohio Conference then became the first to form a conference-wide youth organization. And at the time, that youth organization was known as Christian Volunteers, right? Not the official youth ministry that we know it to be today. In 1890, then the first youth ministry related manual appeared under the title Manual of Suggestions for Those Conducting Youth Meetings. These ideas spread rapidly, and by 1891, youth societies were basically forming across various parts of the world. We see one forming in Wisconsin, one forming in Australia, as well as other parts of the world where basically some people were even adopting this whole idea that they'll issue out missionary volunteer membership cards. And that's sort of like how you would prove your affiliation with that youth society or that youth ministry. And yeah, by 1904, the first manual of young people's work appeared. So when you read the book Church Heritage, it actually says that to begin with, youth ministry came under the direction of the Sabbath School Department, right? So it was just an offshoot from the Sabbath School Department. But in 1907, the GC Youth Department became a formal structure within the church. And Elder Kern was basically appointed as the first director for youth ministry. So that's just a bit of background to basically say that we didn't always have a youth ministry within the church. And yeah, it was started out by a 17-year-old and a 14-year-old within the church, where they established this young ministry, and through formalization and bringing about like official documentation and making sure that this youth society is adopted across different believers within obviously the church across the world. Eventually it gained such momentum that the GC conference officially recognized it and established it as a department that we now even have officially within the church. So that's youth ministry. Now, with the Cole Porter ministry, I think we are all well aware of this ministry as well. In 1879, Ellen White was shown that there was a need to circulate books as widely as possible among the public. So it was very important to not only concentrate our efforts on word of mouth or kind of like preaching to people directly, but to actually produce material that we actually leave people with. So 2 years later, George King felt the burden to sell Uriah Smith's book, Daniel and the Revelation. And as we've already mentioned, that Uriah Smith is also one of the big pioneers in the Adventist church. So the plan was very successful, and it basically gave birth to formalizing this ministry as the Cole Porter ministry to the church. And we know that even today, some people are fully sustained through this ministry, or in other parts of the world, people earn school scholarships during the summer months through this ministry as well. We also see that in around 1878, the tithing system was fully adopted, which replaced the systematic benevolence plan, which is what I think what the church was following at the time. So there was this new combination of tithes and book sales, and this greatly strengthened all phases of ministry. So basically, the various phases of the ministry now had a financial backing or support. So the plan of tithes and systematic offerings essentially enabled the church to finance or to build up this financial backing of establishing a worldwide mission. And that is essentially what I was speaking about in section 6, to basically say that the church made an official effort for them to say that we are not going to just centralize ourselves only in America. Let's spread out to the various countries in Europe. And from there, after we've established those missionary bases, let us now send people to the rest of the world so that people can know about Jesus and specifically Adventist doctrine that speak to the second coming of Christ. So that's what tithing enables the church to do. And I love the fact that even now in the quarterly, we're speaking about giving, tithing, offering, and how those various forms of financially contributing to the church essentially enable the work of God to move forward. So it's nice to see that that's penned down in history to say that this is what essentially really boosted the efforts of the church in terms of establishing a worldwide mission, in that this systematic offering enables the church to do. So I think let us obviously digest that in the way that it needs to be digested, and in the correct manner respond, in a way that we think is in line with what we see the pioneers eventually basically did, and what has contributed to the church being what it is today. Then when we're looking at the church statistics, by 1883, this is 20 years after the organization, I think, of the church, the number of churches had basically increased over fivefold, whereby there was a start of about 125 when the church was established, to now a number of 680. So that was the achievement in 20 years. And the number kept on growing substantially. And yeah, membership essentially jumped up fivefold as well, from 3,500 to about close to 17,000, 18,000. And now also the tithing, which as I mentioned, of how significant it was now ready to surpass, or it had built up so much momentum that it was now ready to surpass the 100,000 USD mark, which obviously at that time is a significant amount of money. Now, as I mentioned, that chapter 7, which is the chapter that I'm basically facilitating for this evening, it speaks about the significant advances as well as the significant losses of the church up until the early years of the 1900s. So in this part of the study, we'll just look at the significant advances that happened in this mission, in these efforts that the church was supporting in establishing missionary bases and sending people out to various parts of the world. So we see that the GC president, who was George Butler at the time, he visited Europe in 1884 and was one of the leaders in basically forming the European Conference. We see that Ellen White was also in setting this up as well, in that she paid a visit to this conference and was there for an extended period of time. Australia received also a group of missionaries, which was led by Haskell and Israel and Collis, who were able to start a very strong work there in spite of the opposition that they faced. So, and it says that in the book Church Heritage, that an early order of business was to open a publishing house in Melbourne. So when they went there, they were very specific about saying that in telling people about this Jesus that is coming for the second time, part of those efforts includes, which is linked to the Karl Porter ministry, publishing books in this country. And as soon as they got there, that is one of the things that they made sure to implement. Now we move on to New Zealand as the next region that received the Advent message through Elder Haskell. This was in round about 1885, who basically prepared the land, if I can put it that way, for A.G. Daniels, who followed on just a year later. Then we hear about what happened in Pitcairn Island, and that place was basically ministered to by John Tay in 1886. And we also see that in the Fiji Islands, J.E. Fulton also followed sort of like a similar approach by spreading the word of God in that island as well. And yeah, these are also the men who basically, in those islands, there are colleges that are now named after them. I think it's Fulton more specifically. Then we move on to the advancement of the gospel into Africa. So we see that Africa received the message during the same year as in Pitcairn Island, as well as the Fiji Islands. So that is the year 1886. There's actually a book out which speaks about the early years of the missionary work in Africa. And that book is called Desert Track and Jungle Trail by Virgil Robinson. So it's not really still in print, but it can still be found according to the Church Heritage Book. So if you do have those interests to see how the Adventist message reached the continent of Africa and how it grew, those are the books that are actually being recommended. So about 8 years later, in 1894, Peter Wessels basically had a small delegation that visited Cecil Rhodes, who owned much of the land basically in South Africa and going into Zimbabwe, and essentially they requested land from him in Rhodesia, if I'm not mistaken. And yeah, Rhodes was willing, and he instructed that whatever part of the land that they needed, they should be given. They have the permit to basically say, listen, take that part of the land. And that is basically how Solisi College, which we know is in Zimbabwe, came about. It was through the efforts of Peter Wessels, that delegation requesting land from Cecil John Rhodes, who was the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony at the time. Then we look at the efforts of Abraham LaRue in Hong Kong, which happened just 2 years later in 1888, who he was a colporteur himself, a self-supporting colporteur, meaning that he relied on selling books, literature for his sustenance. So he visited Hong Kong, China, and also prepared the way for other missionaries who were coming on later, such as Wilbur and Anderson, to spread the message of the coming of Christ in China. Then moving on, the book Church Heritage says that in the years 1860s and in the 1870s, Adventist evangelists were so actually busy. And this is a very powerful point, and I hope we're all listening. So Adventist evangelists were so busy proving that God's law had not been abolished at the cross that they gave little attention to the faith of Jesus, right? And stressed the commandments of God. So there was a very legalistic approach to the how can I say, to the Christian walk at the time. People overly emphasized on obedience and the commandments of God, but also not having a healthy balance between, yes, uphold the commandments of God and the things that he has said, but also possess the faith of Jesus Christ, So the writer of the book says that there were also still some who held Iranian views of Christ. So Iranian views of Christ is basically these views that speak to the Trinity and people's view of the role of Jesus in the Trinity. So the writer says that during this time there were also some who still held some of these incorrect views, and who did not believe in the Trinity nor in the personality of the Holy Spirit. And when I was preparing for the study today, I was actually so impressed, by the fact that there truly isn't nothing new under the sun. There are so many arguments that we think that we are putting out, and they sound so intellectual, but you see that from the 1800s, people have been holding some of the views that we are trying to resuscitate, or we're trying to bring life to. And because God is who he is, all knowing, he's already provided wisdom and actual, how can I say it, wisdom and actual instruction on those matters. But it's just that sometimes in our own questioning, we're not as diligent in trying to find out some of these answers, and we therefore end up confusing ourselves and bringing about unnecessary conflict, intrapersonal conflict with ourselves when it comes to the faith that we claim to possess. And maybe let me even say our membership or our affiliation to the Adventist Church. So that's just to say that if you also hold some of these views that the writer of the book is clearly outlining, to say that, hey, people have actually argued some of these things that people are bringing up now, I think then you need to also be diligent enough to go back, as we see that in church history. People were asking the same questions, or rather fighting the same battles. So be as diligent with your study as you are with some of the questions that you may have. So that's just the lesson that I wanted to share there. So given this background, the GC session of 1888, it basically became a very significant GC session because there was basically a new crisis that had been reached within the church, and it had to be dealt with. The decade following 1888 was marked by many revivals across the conference and the churches that subscribed to it. And righteousness by faith was one of the messages that was vigorously discussed and debated, and ultimately, gratefully accepted by the saints. So yeah, a full and well-documented study of this meeting has been published by Edwin Froome. So if you ever want to know what happened in that session, who was arguing with who, what was the point of contention, what Ellen White said, all of those things, it's actually been written. So there's no need for anyone to be confused. So a number of new books also came out during this time, which basically were addressing some of these, as I said, the Iranian views of Christ, questions around Christ's position, his role in the Trinity, the personality of the Holy Spirit. Like during that time, that's when Ellen White brought out the books, Desire of Ages and Steps to Christ, which were designed specifically to help correct the erroneous teachings on the nature of Christ, and basically endorsing the support by the spirit of prophecy, by the prophet of God, to basically say that there is truth, or the message of righteousness by faith is co-signed by God. Like it's the actual, it is how can I say it? It is a correct doctrine, if I can put it that way. So just to bring about the fact that some of these debates, as I've already said, they've already been debated before, they've already been well documented, so there's no need for us to feel confused or feel that we have been left without instruction. So as the church was also moving out across the world, establishing mission bases, officially sending out missionaries, getting land, there was also an institutional expansion. So basically there was a birth of a lot of Adventist institutions across the world. So we see here that Heidelberg College, at least for the South African context, it was the first Seventh-day Adventist college outside of North America. And yeah, it was opened down there. It's not in Cape Town, as some people sometimes say. But yeah, it's near Cape Town. So I think I love that the book is very clear about that. Yeah, and similarly to Heidelberg College, other early institutions overseas were established in England, Australia, Germany, such as Science Publishing Company and Avondale College in Australia, the Stanborough Press in England, as well as Hamburg Publishing House in Germany. So I don't know why I keep thinking that Avondale is in Zimbabwe, but I think maybe it's because they have a high school called Avondale. I'm not sure. But to be clear, in case anyone is also or was confused as I was, Avondale College is actually in Australia. Then we also read about how Ellen White actually spent a significant amount of time in Australia. Basically, she sailed there in 1891, and she remained there for 9 years, and also spent a bit of time in New Zealand, right? So 9 years is quite some time. And while she was there, she helped found the Avondale College, which is one of the institutions that was established in Australia. And yeah, she also encouraged the establishment of health food factories, such as the Sanitarium Health Food Company, which is very successful and is actually still one of the big financial backers of the South Pacific Division of the church. So those were all coming out. So Avondale, the Sanitarium Health Food Company, these are all coming out from basically the initial efforts of Ellen White back in 1891. Then there was the first Union Conference, and yeah, the first regional grouping of conferences had to be formed, as a Union Conference took place in Australia 1894. And today, well, this book is a bit aged, but by 1997, there were 95 unions in the world church. So we could basically see that in the efforts of the church being intentional about sending missionaries out and spreading God's word, not only in America, not only in Europe, but across the Pacifics, let's go to Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, China, Africa. We see that the efforts bore fruit in that by 1997 there were now of 95 official unions that the World Church could basically account for, to say that these are Seventh-day Adventist unions officially recognized by the General Conference. There was also a reorganization that then happened in 1901, and this was also a very significant decision that happened for the church and the structure. In that during that session, major changes took place, which basically allowed for churches now at the local level to have more, if I can say, freedom, if I can put it that way. So in the book Church Heritage, it says that major changes took place in the management structure, which gave much greater freedom of decision making to the church at the local level, allowing for maximum expansion into all the world. So churches at the local level were given a bit more autonomy, and this decentralization, I think it helped a lot, so that churches can make some of the decisions that they needed to make for themselves without always having to be led to go left, right by the GC. As we can imagine, that can cause some friction and it just delays. So some of the changes that came out of the GC session of 1901 was that the GC conference was now enlarged and made more representative. Union conferences or missions and local conferences or missions became the pattern of organization, right? So as I said, establishing missions across the world and local conferences now became an official effort from the church, and conferences were to share their tithes and offerings with the missions. I love that point. It's very, very important. Conferences were to share their tithes and offerings with the missions. And also, as we even see today, various independent organizations representing various interests of the Seventh-day Adventist Church became departments of the General Conference. So as I mentioned with the youth, how the youth department basically came to be. It became officially recognized by the church, after it went through its various developmental stages, if I can put it that way. So this 1901 GC session became known as the turning point toward unity, reform, solvency, and ardent evangelism. And that's essentially what we've been speaking about, to basically say that the church was now organizing itself officially, making sure that the doctrine that is teaching, it's not only there to basically condemn people against the law, but to also point them to the fact that we are serving and are praying to a God who's righteous. And it's kind of like you need to balance out those two doctrines in order for your theology to be more complete. Speaking to the fact that we are a mission-led church. So evangelism is a very important part of our how can I say, the fabric of who we are as a church. So the 1901, I think, session was basically highlighting a lot of these efforts and making them official, to basically say that this is the stance of our church. Then, in as much as the church was also experiencing significant successes, there were also significant losses that the church was now experiencing, which I think were unique for the time, in the sense that right now, obviously, we don't have any of the pioneers living with us. But at that time, if you were a Seventh-day Adventist, you lived during the times of the pioneers. So when either one of them passed away, I can imagine that it was quite a blow and a painful experience for those who knew them, and I think even saw the sacrifices and the efforts that these mighty men, specifically for this purpose of this slide, sort of like the sacrifices that these men made in establishing the church to be what it is today. But I love how the book basically, doesn't say, oh, they died or anything like that, but it says that they were just called to rest. And I think that is in line with our understanding of, the state of the dead, that these people, they're not hurting, they're not stressing where they are, they're not alive as our ancestors or anything. They're just in a state of rest, fully unconscious of their state as well. So I'm just saying that I just loved the way that the book puts it, to say that these were mighty men, but they're just resting. you know. But anyways, in 1881, we saw the death of James White basically be the start, or as the book said, it basically heralded an end to the era of the pioneers in America, because thereafter we start seeing a lot of deaths. So James White was the first one to pass away in 1881. Then we have John Byington, who passed away 6 years later. And remember, Byington was the first president of the GC. And yeah, he was buried next to the first Adventist in Battle Creek, David Hewitt. And yeah, for his funeral, I loved this so much. Church Heritage, it basically highlights that for his funeral, he had previously chosen as the text Revelation chapter 3, verse 21, which says, "To him that overcometh." And I found that to be so powerful, because I think that should be the I think, the words of meditation for each and every one of us when we are on our deathbeds, or we are being called to rest, to say that I've like run my race, I fought the good fight, and I have overcome, because that's all that matters essentially. That is really, I think, the essence of why we are committing to this sometimes difficult walk of being Christians. We want to overcome. And I love how the first GC president had that, like, as his, I guess, yeah, like how he chose that text, "To him that overcometh." It was very powerful for me. And then we see that in 1883, John Andrews passed away. In 1888, Wagner went, and yeah, both of them are buried in Basel, in Switzerland. Then Uriah Smith, who was a long-time contributor to the Review, he also died in 1903. And his book, Thoughts on Daniel and the Revelation, and I think some of us are well aware of this, it's still much used today. Obviously not in, I wouldn't say, I think it's much used by those who are, present truth brothers and sisters who are committed to studying. Obviously, I'm just saying, if you haven't seen it in churches, it's yeah, you might not find it there, but there definitely are people within our faith who definitely, I think, have feasted on some of these books of the pioneers. And Uriah Smith's contributions on Daniel and Revelation are, I think, one of the, yeah, it's like sort of like a well-known source of information, especially if you're trying to understand either one of those books. So it says here that his death also coincided with the end of the Battle Creek era as well. But yeah, I'll speak to that just now. Then we also saw some pioneers who, it's not that God had called them to rest and that's how their story ended, but they essentially ended up, before dying, ended up removing themselves from the Adventist faith. So we've got Elder D.M. Kenwright. He was a leading minister, but he left the church and became an opposer of the movement. So he was now working against the Adventist movement, which is very sad, because essentially he was one of the pioneers. So yeah, he died a broken and forgotten man. And we see also Dr. Kellogg suffering a similar fate for him. Yeah, he made that decision for himself. He was an administrator of the Battle Creek Sanitarium. But yeah, his problem was that he started mixing up what was being taught with the church with pagan pantheism, and yeah, he left, and he also took the hospital with him. So I think for me, it just speaks to the fact that none of us know the hour of his coming, but also and yeah, we know that probation closes for the individual, obviously, when we're looking at the second coming of Christ, but also your probation can close when you die, and you don't know that hour either, and it's painful to read how people who formed a lot of what we get to enjoy today as Adventists, dying, lost men and women. And for me, it speaks to the fact that don't ever think that just because you were spiritually high in 2007, that is enough. Like, I know we always say that it's not once saved, always saved, but I think I just wanted to reiterate the fact that, yeah, we know that, but how seriously are we actually taking it? Because now we see that you actually can die a lost man. And it's kind of like, what a waste of a life of piety and a life of obedience for you to then only turn around in the end because you suddenly don't want to subscribe to God, things God has plainly stated. for instance, around tithe and offering, you now want to twist that around to what is comfortable for you, or we want to start mixed marriages with people of different faiths who now, endanger our commitment to God and our faithfulness, and yeah, it's just like there's so many, I think, pitfalls. Maybe we're not even good examples to our children because the people we profess to be on Sabbath is our children at home are experiencing a different father or a different mother. It's kind of like there's so many things that I think God has brought us out of and has given us light on, that we must be careful when we now reject those teachings now, because you just don't know what tomorrow is going to look like and if probation for you is going to close. So yeah, let us remember Canright and Kellogg to basically say that these are actual case studies, if I can put it that way, to say that it's definitely not a once saved always saved kind of thing. Every day, all of us must be dying daily and recommitting ourselves to the convictions that God has helped us to gain as we have grown in our personal journeys, in terms of our spiritual walk. So yeah, now I want to just speak about the fire destroying Battle Creek. So earlier on, I spoke about how one of the significant losses for the church was the fire that broke out in Battle Creek. And essentially, what happened at Battle Creek is that God had warned his people several times to basically say that you guys are concentrated in this one area and you're losing the essence of what Adventism is about, which is to go out and spread the message about, my second coming, speak to people about the goodness of God, and just how you should be converted into the truth that Jesus is your savior, and allowing him to shepherd you through life. So the members of the church completely ignored this. Even Ellen White tried to speak to the church, but they didn't listen. They did not want to scatter out and take the good news to other parts of the world. Now we see that in 1893, yeah, they were officially given the message to say, you know what, this institution will be destroyed if you do not decentralize. And we see that not, I think, 9 years later or so, in 1902, the main building of Battle Creek, which is essentially, because what happened is that Adventists now started to treat Battle Creek as this is our place, this is where we go, we just love being Adventists in this one space. So in 1902, the main building of the sanitarium burnt down, and in the same year, the Review Factory was destroyed by fire as well. So a year later, finally, Ellen White's advice on this issue of being concentrated in one location, it was finally heeded. So her advice to move to the headquarters east was heeded, and property was purchased near the nation's capital, which is Washington, D.C., in the context of the USA. So that's basically all I wanted to share about today, to basically say that part of the, how can I say it, part of establishing the church to what we see it today, it wasn't just a spur of spiritual excitement by it wasn't, how can I say it, the Seventh-day Adventist Church it wasn't established because people just had that one sermon where they were like, okay, Jesus is coming, and they were excited. No, that maybe could have been the emotional experience for some, but the experience was so deep that it moved men to not excluding women, but like, yeah, I think you guys understand what I'm saying, but it moved people to basically say that we're going to make this an official movement. We're going to establish ourselves across various parts of the world. We're going to capacitate people to go into different parts of the world and spread this message. We're going to seek out land. We're going to build institutions. We're going to build factories. We're going to start publishing our own literature and spreading that around. And yes, they weren't always perfect in their efforts, because as I mentioned, what happened in Battle Creek. But for those instructions of the Lord that they heeded, we see that the church truly grew into even what we see the church to be today. We see the importance of tithing and offering also coming in to basically say that when the church made this official, the, when they institutionalized it, if I can put it that way, for lack of a better word, it really fueled the church, and these are some of the things that we need to think about, to say that, okay, if it worked then, I'm sure it can still work today. God does not change. The same God that inspired them is the same God that is inspiring us in our efforts and how, we choose to navigate life. We're also learning today the importance of staying on the narrow way and remembering that tomorrow is not promised. You never know if you'll die like Ken Wright and Kellogg as a broken and forgotten man, because you have decided to mix up what God has shown you with what your maybe interpretations may be, and not to then say that your interpretations aren't correct. But as I mentioned before, some of the questions that we have in the church actually have already been debated from the 1800s with the same level of vigor that you question the doctrine of the church, is the same level of vigor that you should be applying to say, I'm going to wake up at 3 a.m. and I'm going to study this thing. Because it's not that God has left us without a guide or without any form of specific instructions in terms of dealing with some topics which may I think at a high level they seem not to be how can I say it, very straightforward. So if you have certain questions, you need to study. You need to study, otherwise you run the risk of becoming a Kellogg of 2023 or 2024 or 2025, whenever probation closes for me or for you. So this is why it's important for us to study church history. This is why it's important for us to study the pioneers and some of the experiences that they had, because it's a message of encouragement, but also a message of warning, to basically say that when you do right, this is what happens. This is how God blesses. This is how God is able to sustain and to move this church forward. But also, that's the beauty of God. He gives us free will. If you decide to choose disobedience, and yeah, no one wakes up and says, I'm choosing to disobey, but I think when you're disobeying. As I've already mentioned, Ken Wright, our own versions of Ken Wright and Kellogg. If you do that, you're disobeying, and that comes with consequences. Sometimes consequences that can even cost you your salvation altogether. So I think that's me in summary, at least